Winter, 1944, settled over the world like a shroud, heavy, dark, and unyielding. Across Europe, entire nations felt as if they were breathing through smoke. The Ardennes, once a quiet stretch of forest and farmland, erupted into the last great gamble of a collapsing Reich. American boys were falling in Belgium's snow by the thousands. London shuddered under the howl of V-2 rockets, each explosion carving new scars into a city already held together by grit alone. Civilians in Berlin and Hamburg lived on rations so thin that a full stomach had become a distant memory. Nutrition charts showed an average of 900 to 1,200 calories a day, barely enough for survival. In the Pacific, the fighting had turned into something primal. On Luzon and Peleliu, Marines clawed their way forward inch by inch while Japanese defenders fought with a ferocity that defied logic and life expectancy. Corpsmen wrote more letters home than ever, telling mothers and wives that their sons had not suffered. Few believed the words they were writing. The world had learned a grim lesson by 1944. Total war demanded total cruelty. Every nation seemed to be sinking deeper into a belief that mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Except, strangely, the United States. For all its grief and Gold Star families, America in 1944 stood on a mountain of abundance unlike anything the world had ever seen. Her factories never slept. Assembly lines ran like rivers of steel, pouring out 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and millions of rifles, bullets, radios, and field rations. The butcher shops of Chicago and the stockyards of Omaha produced more meat in a month than some nations produced in a year. It was said, quietly, sometimes with disbelief, that America had so much food she could feed her own soldiers, her civilians, and every prisoner she captured, and still have enough to spare. To Americans, this was simply what their nation did in times of crisis: work harder, produce more, and share the weight. To the rest of the world, it looked like an impossibility. Against this backdrop, thousands of German prisoners were shipped across the Atlantic, not to secret prisons or underground bunkers, but to camps scattered across the American heartland. Texas alone held tens of thousands. The idea baffled Axis commanders. How could the United States afford to house, feed, and supervise enemy soldiers while fighting a global war? But America had been built on the backs of men and women who believed in doing things thoroughly. If the country was going to run POW camps, then it would run them according to rules. Its rules, rooted in a quiet confidence that decency was part of its strength, not a weakness. It was into this strange and bewildering world that a group of German prisoners stepped on a biting December afternoon. Their transport truck rattled along the gravel road toward Camp Hearn, Texas, a place they had been told would resemble a hell built just for them. Rumors traveled, faster than facts during wartime, and the men had heard all of them. Americans starved their prisoners. Americans humiliated them. Americans were mongrels who lacked discipline, culture, and honor. Some of the men, especially those from the Eastern Front, carried horrors of Soviet captivity in their minds. They whispered to each other that perhaps the Americans would not be quite that brutal, but no one dared hope for anything beyond bare survival. The war had stripped them of the ability to expect kindness from anyone. As the truck creaked to a halt, the prisoners braced themselves. Boots thudded on the wooden boards as they were ordered down, their hands stiff from cold and exhaustion. They climbed out one by one, blinking in the sharp Texan sunlight. And then they froze, because right there, standing proudly in the middle of the parade ground, framed by barbed wire fences and guard towers, was a Christmas tree. A real tree. Full, green, decorated with strings of tinsel and hand-cut paper stars. Beneath it sat wooden crates wrapped in colored paper, though no one could imagine what they contained. The tree looked absurdly out of place, like something from a Bavarian town square that had been dropped into a military compound by mistake. The prisoners stared, unable to process the sight. One of them, a young corporal named Heinrich Bauer, whispered hoarsely, "Is this a trick? Some sort of mockery?" Another muttered, "They're laughing at us. They must be." But no one was laughing. Not the guards, who stood quietly at ease, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Not the American sergeant, who stepped forward, his breath drifting in the cold air as he looked over the new arrivals. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't gloating. He looked tired. And strangely calm. The sergeant raised his voice just enough to carry. "You boys picked quite the night to get here," he said, the Texan drawl unmistakable. "It's Christmas Eve." Some of the prisoners glanced at one another in confusion. Christmas Eve? Here, in a war camp. He continued, "You'll get your bunk sorted. Then you can come to the mess hall for supper. It won't be fancy, but it'll be hot. Tomorrow we'll have a proper Christmas meal. You'll see." The words hit the Germans like a blow. A proper Christmas meal? For prisoners. Back home, their families were spending the holiday in basements, hiding from Allied bombers or scraping together what little they had left. Some of the men hadn't tasted a real Christmas dinner in years. Others had assumed they never would again. And yet, here they stood, on enemy soil, being told, calmly, casually, that they would be fed and treated with a dignity they had not expected in wartime. Heinrich felt something twist painfully in his chest. "Why would they do this?" he whispered. An older POW answered quietly, bitterness still clinging to his voice. "Americans show off. They want us to see their wealth." But even as he spoke the words, he didn't sound convinced, because the tree didn't look like a show of power. It looked sincere, carefully built, tender even. As the prisoners were led toward their barracks, many kept glancing back at the tree, as if it might vanish the moment they turned away. And among the guards, young Americans from farms, factories, and small towns, something else was happening. They watched the prisoners with an uncomfortable awareness that these men weren't monsters. They were thin, exhausted, homesick boys, not much different from themselves. One guard murmured, almost to himself, "My ma would have done the same for any stranger on Christmas." Another nodded. "Doesn't matter if they're Germans, it's just the right thing to do." There it was, the shock that neither side had expected. Not the tree itself, nor the decorations, nor even the promise of a Christmas meal. The shock was this simple truth. In the darkest winter of the deadliest war, America had chosen to treat its enemies like human beings, and the German prisoners, still reeling from the cold and the journey, could not begin to understand why. Fear was the only luggage the prisoners carried with certainty. It didn't buckle or tear, and no guard could confiscate it. It lived in their ribs, in the way their shoulders hunched instinctively, in the constant flick of their eyes toward anything that moved too quickly. By the winter of 1944, every German soldier knew what happened to men who surrendered, or rather, they thought they knew. For years, the Reich had built its propaganda on the same unyielding pillars. Americans were savages. Americans were a mongrel race of cowards and criminals. Americans mutilated prisoners, humiliated them, starved them, executed them without trial. Films shown in barracks depicted U.S. soldiers laughing as they beat defenseless captives. Posters portrayed them with grotesque exaggerated features, rifles dripping blood. Military briefings warned that anyone captured by the Americans might as well consider himself already dead. Better a bullet on the battlefield, they said, than the hands of a merciless enemy. The stories weren't entirely invented. They were stitched together with threads pulled from Germany's own sins. Many German POWs had seen what their country did to Soviet prisoners: starvation, exposure, execution. Some had worked near concentration camps and smelled the truth rising from those chimneys. If Germany was capable of that, they assumed the Allies must be capable of worse. Every tyrant believes the world is filled with men like himself. So when the same men were herded into rail cars, marched to ports, and loaded onto Liberty ships bound for a land they had never seen, fear was the only map they trusted. The Atlantic crossing was a grim echo of earlier nightmares. The ship groaned with every wave, the metal hull shivering under the weight of hundreds of prisoners, crammed into its belly. They slept sitting up, knees to their chests, the air thick with sweat and sea salt. The hold was not cruel. There was water, bread, a chance to climb the deck for air, but for men trained to expect torture, even a kind gesture felt like a setup. The rumors spread with every passing day. They're taking us to labor camps. No, execution sites. Why else bring us across the ocean? They'll use us for experiments. The Americans are animals. One night, during a storm that tossed the ship like a toy, a young soldier named Lenz whispered into the darkness, "They'll drown us before we reach shore. Why waste bullets?" His voice trembled, but no one contradicted him. Fear made every theory sound logical. But 11 days later, when the ship approached New York Harbor, the prisoners were met with a sight that shattered the outlines of the world they thought they understood. Lights. Not a handful. Not a few scattered lamps flickering like tired fireflies. But an explosion. No, a constellation. Of light across the Manhattan skyline. Towers stabbed the sky, illuminated from top to bottom as if electricity grew from the ground itself. Even in wartime blackout, New York glowed like a living star. Some POWs pressed their faces to the railing, breath catching in their throats. They had been told America was weak, decadent, barely holding itself together. But no starving, collapsing nation could shine like that. One prisoner murmured, "This cannot be a country at war." Another answered, "Maybe they are not human after all." From New York, the prisoners were loaded onto trains that carried them deep into the American interior. They rattled past towns with neat rows of houses, past farms with fields so wide the horizon seemed to swallow them whole. And everywhere, there was abundance. Cattle herds stretching farther than German imagination allowed. Silos rising like monuments to harvests that came on time, year after year. Factories that roared day and night with the confidence of a nation that feared nothing. The more they saw, the more terrified they became. Abundance was a weapon, too. A nation that fed its civilians and soldiers this well. What would it do to its enemies? What depths of power were they walking into? By the time the train pulled into Texas and the men were marched toward the gates of Camp Hearn, their fear had reached its peak. Even the Christmas tree they found waiting for them, so impossibly gentle, so absurdly kind, felt like a lure. No enemy would decorate for men he intended to treat well. When Christmas Day finally arrived, the prisoners approached the mess hall in a tense, silent line. They had slept poorly. Many had nightmares of poisoned food, of traps disguised as hospitality. The rumors had returned with renewed vigor. "They'll make us eat until we're sick. They'll humiliate us somehow." This is how they break people, by confusing them. The moment they stepped inside, their fears twisted into something darker. The smell hit first. Rich, warm, familiar, impossible. Roast turkey, real turkey, carrying the scent of thyme and butter, mashed potatoes whipped smooth with cream, gravy thick and steaming. Hot rolls brushed with melted butter. Apple pie cooling on a side table. Coffee brewed fresh in massive metal urns. It was too much, far too much. A soldier named Richter blinked rapidly, as if the sight itself was a hallucination. "What is this?" he breathed. "Feeding prisoners a feast? No army is this generous." Another prisoner, older and gaunt, hissed back, "Use your head. They want something from us." But what could the Americans possibly want? When a guard motioned them forward, many hesitated. Plates were handed out. Food was ladled generously. And still the men stood rigid, uncertain whether to lift their forks. Kindness in their experience was often the first step toward exploitation. Finally, one prisoner muttered exactly what everyone else feared to say aloud. "Maybe they want us to eat until we die." A guard overheard the comment and frowned but said nothing. Hands trembled as they reached for utensils. Some refused to breathe near the steam rising from the plates. One soldier held his fork like a weapon, as though the food might leap from the plate and attack him. Fear had turned generosity into terror, and beneath it all, an unspoken dread pulsed through the room. If the Americans were this kind, then the Germans had been lied to. About everything. That idea, the terrible destabilizing possibility that their enemy was more humane than their own leaders, was more frightening than any rifle or guard tower. Even kindness in the eyes of men raised on fear could look like the sharpest of traps. And in that moment, sitting before the most extravagant meal they had seen in years, the German prisoners of Camp Herne truly believed that the more gentle the gesture, the more dangerous its purpose must be. The strangeness of the moment grew heavier as the prisoners sat before their untouched plates. Silence hovered above the rows of wooden tables, broken only by the soft clatter of utensils in the hands of American cooks preparing another tray at the counter. The Germans waited for the trick, for the command that would reveal the humiliation behind this elaborate display. But no command came. Instead, a young American private with sandy hair and a boyish, unguarded smile stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron. "Merry Christmas, boys," he said, as naturally as if he were greeting cousins arriving late to a family supper. His voice wasn't mocking. It wasn't triumphant. It carried the unadorned warmth of someone raised in a home where kindness was a daily habit, not a strategic gesture. Some of the Germans looked up sharply, expecting to catch sarcasm in his face, but they found none. The private simply nodded once, then moved on to pour coffee into tin mugs. Another American, older, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long work days and longer responsibilities, set down a basket of warm rolls on a table near the center of the room. "Pass it around," he said gently. None of the prisoners moved. The man hesitated for a moment, then added, "Go on. Nobody leaves here hungry." To the Germans, the words felt like an assault. Who, in a world collapsing into violence, spoke like that to the enemy? Who insisted a prisoner eat well? But the Americans did. And they did so with the same steady confidence with which they marched, built, produced, and fought. It was part of who they were. A corporal among the guards nudged a younger soldier beside him. "You'd think they've never seen a hot meal," the kid whispered. "They haven't," the corporal answered quietly. "Not in a long time." The kid swallowed, suddenly aware of how much he had taken for granted. The rows of canned goods in his mother's pantry, the Sunday roasts, the butter that never ran out. He watched the prisoners, thin, wary men with hollow cheeks, and felt something shift, something almost paternal. "They look like boys," he murmured. "That's because they are boys," the corporal replied. It was this recognition, the stripping away of uniforms, flags, and propaganda until only the humanity remained, that defined the greatest generation more than any battlefield victory. A German sergeant named Weber stared at the mound of mashed potatoes on his plate as if it were a piece of unexploded ordnance. He lifted a spoon halfway, then lowered it again, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. A guard caught his eye, not with suspicion but with a kind of quiet encouragement. "Well?" the guard asked. "Go on, it won't bite." Weber blinked. He didn't know what to do with a voice that wasn't hostile. He had been trained to expect hatred. Instead, he found neighborly concern. Across the room, one of the prisoners whispered, "What do these Americans want from us?" A man across from him shook his head slowly. "If they wanted to torture us," he said, "they wouldn't start with Turkey." The absurdity of the statement hung between them. And still, the Americans kept coming, bringing more food, smiling politely, treating them like guests instead of captured enemy soldiers. When one of the cooks, a tall Texan with sleeves rolled to his elbows, noticed the prisoner's hesitation, he stepped closer. His accent was thick as warm molasses. "What's wrong? Food not good?" He frowned as if genuinely concerned. "Tell me what you boys like. You eat different back home?" They stared at him. He was asking for culinary preferences. From prisoners. The Texan scratched his jaw. "Well, hell. My ma taught me you don't let a soul sit down at your table and leave hungry." Then he pointed at their plates. "Eat. It's Christmas." What the prisoners didn't know, what most Americans never needed to say aloud, was that their government had made a deliberate choice. President Roosevelt had insisted from the start of the war that the United States would follow the Geneva Convention with strict integrity, not because the enemy deserved mercy, but because America deserved to remain America. Humanity was policy, kindness was strategy, and decency was doctrine. When a group of guards questioned why prisoners were getting the same quality of food as American soldiers, their commanding officer gave a simple answer. "Because we're the United States Army. That's the standard. We don't drop it for anyone." And then he added something quieter. "This is how we win. Not just the war, but the world." The Germans felt that standard everywhere. The camp had a library filled with donated books. From Dickens to Mark Twain to volumes of poetry prisoners could not understand but still held reverently. There were soccer fields where the Germans played matches that drew curious American spectators. There were English classes, Bible studies, workshops where men learned carpentry, metalwork, mechanics, skills they could use long after the war ended. A rotating team of civilian volunteers arrived each week with crates of vitamins, soap, and stationery. The prisoners, who were used to strict rationing and shortages, stared at the abundance as though it might vanish. And slowly, though no one spoke of it aloud, a dangerous truth seeped into their minds. America cared more for its prisoners than Germany cared for its own people. It was a thought that tasted like betrayal. The kindness continued in small, almost invisible moments. When a prisoner tore his sleeve on a fence post, a guard fetched a needle and thread. When a man grew feverish, he was rushed to the camp infirmary where a doctor and 2 nurses tended to him through the night. When someone's boots wore thin, a guard found him another pair. These were not grand gestures. They were habits, quiet extensions of a culture raised on the belief that treating others well was not optional. One afternoon, as the meal wound down and the prisoners remained stiffly seated, unsure if they were allowed to stand, a young American private approached an older German officer. The officer's hands were trembling around his coffee cup. The private placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're all right," he said softly. "You're safe now." The officer didn't reply. He simply stared at the hand resting on his own worn coat sleeve, unable to comprehend a kindness that crossed battle lines. As the prisoners filed out of the mess hall that day, most left in silence. The fear hadn't vanished. It clung to them like a second skin, but something else had slipped beneath it. Confusion. Confusion that felt strangely like hope, but too fragile to name. Behind them, the American cooks stacked trays, chatted casually, and prepared for the next shift. To them, the meal had been nothing extraordinary, just another Christmas, just another night doing what Americans did. But for the prisoners, men raised on warnings of American brutality, men who had survived bombings and retreat and hunger, the meal was incomprehensible. Kindness felt more dangerous than cruelty. And yet, as they walked back to their barracks under the mild Texas sky, many found themselves glancing back toward the mess hall, unable to shake the warmth they had found there. A warmth more powerful, more disarming than any weapon they had encountered in the war. For a long moment, the mess hall felt suspended in a kind of fragile silence, thin as glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. The Germans sat before their plates of turkey, potatoes, rolls, and pie, each man struggling with the same impossible question. What did it mean to be treated gently by the enemy? The Americans didn't hover. They didn't watch with suspicion. They simply moved about the room refilling coffee, clearing trays, and offering the kind of casual hospitality they would have shown to any stranger passing through their hometown diner. This normalcy, this lack of performance, only made the prisoners' unease sharpen. Then someone finally lifted his fork. It was a Hasi named Erich Hoffmann. A 24-year-old machinist from Hamburg before the war took everything familiar from his hands. His fingers trembled as he cut into the slice of apple pie on his plate. He brought the bite to his mouth hesitantly, like a man testing reality itself. The moment the flavors touched his tongue, warm apple, cinnamon, butter, sugar, his face went slack, his breath caught. And then, as though the weight of every winter since 1941 collapsed at once, a sound escaped him. A broken, raw, choking sob that he tried desperately to swallow back down. He failed. Hoffmann pressed a hand to his mouth, shoulders shaking. The fork clattered onto his plate. Around him, men turned, startled. The American cook nearest him paused mid-step. But Hoffmann wasn't crying from hunger. He wasn't crying from fear. He was crying because that single bite of pie had carried him home. He saw, in an instant, the soft yellow light of his mother's kitchen in Hamburg. He saw her apron dusted with flour, the window cracked open to let in the cool spring air. He heard her humming an old folk song as she pulled a pan of fresh pie from the oven. He remembered reaching for a slice too early and burning his fingertips, and her laughing, telling him he had no patience but a good heart. That kitchen was rubble now. His mother gone. The world that pie belonged to had been buried under ash and fire. Yet here he was, in a prison camp on the far side of the world, tasting it again. It broke him. His sobs grew harsher, and he bent over his plate as though trying to fold himself around his grief. A ripple of emotion spread outward. Another prisoner blinked rapidly, his own eyes filling. Someone muttered, "Mein Gott," under his breath. A third reached instinctively for Hoffmann's shoulder but stopped halfway, hand hovering in midair. Across the room, a tall American private named Tom Richardson stepped toward the table, concern furrowing his brow. "You all right, buddy?" he asked softly. Hoffman tried to answer but could only shake his head, tears streaking down his cheeks. Richardson knelt beside him. Not as a guard, not as a conqueror, but simply as a young man seeing another human being in pain. "You're safe here," he murmured. "You hear me? You're safe." A whisper traveled through the room. Then another voice, a quieter, older one, rose from a nearby table. A German corporal, staring at his untouched turkey, asked the question every man in the room had been thinking since the moment they'd stepped inside. "Why?" he said, the word trembling in the cold air. "Why would the enemy do this?" The young private standing beside him didn't hesitate. He answered with a simple truth he had grown up believing without ever needing to articulate it. "Because you're men," he said, "and men ought to eat." The room went utterly still, a sentence that simple should not have held such weight. But for men who had marched through frost and hunger, who had seen prisoners on the Eastern Front reduced to skeletons, who had heard their own officers speak about human beings as expendable numbers, those words landed like a revelation. Hoffman let out another ragged sob, this one edged with a sound that could have been relief or agony. It was impossible to tell. All at once, the silence cracked. A man at the far table lowered his face into his hands and began to cry openly. Another reached for his coffee, missed the handle, and let the mug fall as a tremor passed through him. Someone else pushed back his chair and stood abruptly, only to sink to his knees as if the weight of the moment had buckled him. One by one, the walls inside the prisoners collapsed. Not from starvation, not from pain, from kindness, from the unbearable realization that after years of brutality and indoctrination, someone had extended them a gentleness they no longer believed they deserved. A man raised in Munich buried his face in his sleeve, shoulders heaving. A former university student from Bremen whispered, I forgot what it was like to be treated kindly." Another prisoner, hands shaking so violently he could barely steady his fork, murmured, "What have we been fighting for, if this is our enemy?" The Americans looked on quietly, some bewildered, some deeply moved, all suddenly aware that the meal they had prepared had become something much larger than a holiday tradition. One guard swallowed hard, whispering to the cook beside him, "My granddad always said, 'Feed a man right and he won't forget it.'" Guess he was. Right. The cook exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "War takes everything from folks," he said. "If we can give back even a piece of it, well, it ain't much, but it's something." At a table near the back, a young German soldier who hadn't shed a tear in 3 years felt something inside him loosen. His throat ached, his vision blurred. When he finally blinked, tears spilled freely. They came not because the food was good, though it was the best he'd tasted since 1939. Not because he felt safe, though safety had a warmth he'd nearly forgotten, and not because he missed home, though the ache of that loss was a constant companion. He cried because someone had looked at him and seen not a uniform, not an ideology, not an enemy, but a person. All across the room, it was the same. Men who had marched under the swastika, who had shouted Sieg Heil, who had believed the Reich's promises, now sat weeping into their Christmas dinner because a handful of American cooks and guards had treated them with ordinary decency. It was ordinary to the Americans. It was extraordinary to the prisoners. Somewhere near the center of the mess hall, Hoffman lifted his head, eyes red, voice cracked. "I don't understand," he whispered. "We were taught you were monsters." Richardson kept his voice gentle. "We were taught the same about you." Hoffman stared at him, and for the first time since he'd been captured, he saw, not a jailer, not an enemy, but a young man who might have been his neighbor, his co-worker, his friend, if life had placed them on a different soil. Tears welled anew, and then something remarkable happened. The men around him, dozens at first, then hundreds, began eating, slowly, hesitantly, reverently. Some closed their eyes with the first bite as though trying to hold the taste in place before the world could take it away. Others ate silently, tears slipping down their cheeks unnoticed. The Americans didn't interrupt. They let the moment unfold, understanding instinctively that what was happening wasn't about food. It was about humanity. Years later, long after the war had ended and the camps were gone, families across America would tell stories, quietly, with pride, of fathers and uncles who had served guard duty in POW camps and had witnessed nights like this one. And Germans who survived would tell their own families that Christmas in Texas was the night they learned what kind of men Americans were. But inside that mess hall, on that winter evening in 1944, nobody was thinking about legacy. They were simply living a truth that cut through uniforms, borders, and war itself. Kindness, offered freely, has the power to break a man open, and in doing so, set something right inside him that war had tried so hard to kill. In the days that followed the Christmas meal, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift inside the camp. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't erupt like a battle line, collapsing. It moved quietly, like dawn creeping over the prairie, slow and steady until the world realized it had changed. The prisoners woke with clearer eyes. They walked with a little less tension in their shoulders. They spoke in softer tones. There was no single moment when fear disappeared and understanding took its place. Instead, it came in small realizations, one after another, each of them reshaping what the men thought they knew about their captors and about themselves. Hoffman, the young machinist from Hamburg, was the first to put the truth into words. He stood outside one morning, hands in his pockets, watching a group of American guards repairing a fence post that had been knocked loose in the wind. They worked easily together, handing each other tools without speaking, smiling occasionally at some private joke. Hoffman had watched German soldiers do the same work 100 times, but with tension in their movements, always under the eye of some officer demanding more speed, more obedience, more fear. He turned to the man beside him, a fellow prisoner named Lammers, and said quietly, "You know, we did not lose because we lacked courage." Lammers raised an eyebrow. "No." Hoffman shook his head. "We lost because they are better men than the ones who led us." Lammers didn't argue. He only exhaled in a long, slow breath, as if the truth, now spoken aloud, hurt, but also relieved him. A few feet away, another prisoner overheard and murmured, "We were fighting for a country with a heart smaller than its wallet." He gestured toward the Americans. "They fight for something else." The comment spread through the barracks like a spark catching dry grass. Because deep down, many of the men had already suspected it. They had seen it in the food, in the fairness, in the simple respect shown to them without being earned. America was not winning the war because it had more factories, more steel, more planes, though that was certainly true. America was winning because it held fast to an idea that Germany had abandoned long ago, that a nation's strength grows from the dignity it extends to others. Letters home reflected this awakening. Before Christmas, most prisoners wrote cautiously, describing the camp in vague, colorless terms. But afterward, their words changed. A POW named Krieger wrote to his mother in Stuttgart, "We are treated humanely, Mama, better than many of our civilians are treated at home. The Americans feed us well, speak to us politely, and follow rules even when no one is watching them. I don't understand it, but I am grateful." Another letter, from a soldier named Falk, was even bolder. "If you could see this place, you would know everything we were told was wrong. The Americans do not hate us. They work, produce, and organize with a discipline we were taught only Germans possessed. But they do it without cruelty." Some letters never made it out of the camp. Censors blacked out lines that revealed too much, but the prisoners copied them by hand to share among themselves. At night, when the barracks were quiet and the prairie wind rattled the tin roofs, men who once believed in the infallibility of the Reich now whispered about a different kind of power. A power rooted in fairness, competence, and a belief so simple it almost felt naive that treating others decently could change the world. One entry found in a POW's diary captured it perfectly. "In Germany, they taught us that greatness comes from power. In America, they show us that greatness comes from character." Comparison became impossible to ignore. In the camp library, stuffed with donated books and magazines, German prisoners leafed through issues of Life and Saturday Evening Post, staring at images of American families celebrating Christmas with full tables, warm living rooms, children laughing around decorated trees. These were not government lies. The evidence was right there in the photographs. Meanwhile, news reached the camp of German cities darkened from bombings, trains halted from fuel shortages, families freezing through the winter on ration cards that barely kept them alive. Prisoners received letters describing mothers fainting in food lines, sisters trading clothing for bread, fathers collapsing from exhaustion. Here in Texas, the prisoners drank fresh milk and brewed coffee daily. They ate butter. Many had not seen real butter in years. It wasn't just abundance, it was order, efficiency, a sense of stability in everything from the farm trucks delivering produce to the precise schedule of mail call. The Americans didn't boast about it. They simply lived it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. One afternoon, while repairing irrigation ditches under a mild winter sun, a prisoner named Adler paused to watch a group of American farmhands working nearby. They moved with easy coordination, talking little, joking occasionally. Adler turned to the American guard beside him. "Your country is very united." The guard shrugged. "We try to be." Adler nodded, though his eyes held a shadow of remorse. "In Germany," he said, "unity is forced. Here, it seems, chosen." The guard didn't answer, but he gave Adler a look, steady, thoughtful, that told him the comment had struck home. The real turning point came a week after Christmas. A winter storm swept through the camp, bringing a sudden blast of freezing wind that toppled a row of drying racks outside one of the barracks. The canvas sheets meant for the infirmary tumbled into the mud. Before any guard could react, a group of prisoners sprinted forward to rescue the linens. They weren't ordered. They weren't supervised. They simply moved together as if instinctively understanding the importance of the task. A young lieutenant watched them and called out, half amused, half impressed, "You boys trying to make my job easier?" One of the prisoners straightened, sheets dripping in his arms. "It's the right thing to do." The lieutenant paused. He hadn't expected that answer, certainly not from men who, weeks earlier, couldn't meet an American's gaze without flinching. He smiled slightly. "Yeah," he said, "it is." From that moment on, the Americans noticed a difference. The prisoners volunteered more readily for tasks. They greeted guards first, instead of waiting silently. Some even attempted broken English when speaking to the cooks or medics. Not from fear, not from survival instinct, from respect. The moral awakening didn't come with a burst of enlightenment. It came in a quiet recognition that morality was not merely preached in the United States, it was practiced. A German sergeant named Schultz, once fiercely loyal to the Reich, summed it up better than any officer or philosopher could have. We thought discipline made a nation strong. Perhaps it is goodness that does. Years later, Americans listening to these stories, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, would feel a familiar swell in their chests. Pride, yes, but also something deeper, more nostalgic, more bittersweet. A longing for a country that believed so deeply in its own moral compass that it extended humanity even to its enemies. They would whisper, "My grandfather guarded POWs in Texas." Or, "My great-uncle was one of those prisoners who cried at Christmas." Or, "If not for America, my family wouldn't exist." Because the truth was simple and profound. America hadn't just defeated Germany on the battlefield. It had defeated the ideology behind it, with fairness, decency, and a generosity so powerful it broke the hearts of the men who received it. In the quiet of Camp Hearn, the prisoners understood that, and for the first time since the war began, many of them found themselves grateful. Grateful to be alive, grateful to be defeated, and grateful to have discovered that strength and kindness could live in the same uniform. In the weeks after Christmas, the camp settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. The winter sun stretched longer across the Texas plains, warming the barracks' roofs and softening the edges of life inside the fences. What had begun as a single shocking holiday meal quietly transformed everything beneath the surface. By January, the prisoners were no longer the same men who had stepped through the gates trembling with suspicion. They rose earlier, moved with purpose, and approached their daily labor with an energy that surprised even the guards. Tasks that once required repeated orders, fence repairs, ditch digging, sorting supplies, were now finished ahead of schedule. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't fear. It was gratitude, sharpened by dawning understanding that they were being treated with a fairness many of them had never known at home. For the first time in years, they spoke of the future. Letters back to Germany took on a different tone. One man wrote to his sister in Cologne, "The Americans treat us with a decency I cannot explain. They feed us properly, speak to us with respect, and keep their promises. I did not expect this, but I am thankful for it." Another wrote to his mother, "Tell no one, but I am learning English. The guards help me with pronunciation. They laugh sometimes, but kindly." Indeed, English classes in the recreation hall filled quickly. What began as a handful of curious POWs turned into nightly groups of 30 or 40 men repeating phrases from chalkboard lessons. Guards would lean against the doorframe, listening, offering corrections, or teasing encouragement. The prisoners laughed, really laughed without tension, for the first time since capture. The hatred that had once been woven into their worldview loosened, thread by thread. As winter melted toward spring, the relationship between prisoners and Texans beyond the camp fence deepened as well. Local ranchers, desperate for labor but wary in the beginning, found themselves unexpectedly fond of the German boys who came to mend fences, pull hay bales, or ride along the pastures. The young men worked hard, followed instructions, and treated the land with respect. One rancher, Henry Abbott, had a son fighting in Italy. At first, he refused assistance from the enemy, but after watching a group of prisoners spend an entire morning fixing a storm-damaged barn roof, he changed his mind. "They look like boys far from home," he told his wife that evening. "Not monsters, just boys." She nodded, setting plates on the dinner table. "Then feed them well," she said simply. Abbott did exactly that. He began bringing sandwiches to the prisoners during work breaks, thick slices of ham on soft white bread, and the young men accepted them with a humility that touched him more deeply than he admitted aloud. Other ranchers followed suit. On Sundays, Texans passing near the camp would slow their trucks to wave at groups of POWs tending the garden or repairing irrigation lines. The prisoners waved back. It was a small gesture, almost ordinary. But in the middle of a world at war, it meant everything. American guards, too, felt the shift. Private Richardson, the same young man who had knelt beside Hoffman in the mess hall, found himself lingering during afternoon duties just to talk with the men he once guarded with suspicion. They asked him about Texas weather, baseball, American slang. He asked them about their families, their towns, their former lives. One afternoon, as he walked a perimeter route with a fellow guard, he said quietly, "It's strange. I forget sometimes that we're supposed to be enemies." His companion nodded. "My granddad used to say a man can hate an army, but he can't hate a man once he knows his story." Inside the barracks, German conversations shifted away from ideology. The old arguments about Hitler, about loyalty, about the promise of the Reich, slowly died out. Hardliners who once barked propaganda in the corners of the room found themselves ignored. Some prisoners, newly confident, even challenged them. "What did the Reich ever give us but hunger?" one man asked. "Look at how the Americans treat even their enemies. If this is weakness, perhaps we misunderstood strength." The words carried a different weight now. Not defiance, not treason. Enlightenment. Some of the prisoners, many of them young and unanchored, began to dream quietly of staying. They spoke in whispers after lights out, imagining a life in a place where food was plentiful, work was honest, and kindness was not rationed by ideology. "Do you think they would let us?" a youth from Bavaria asked Hoffman. Hoffman considered the question, staring at the dark outline of the rafters. "If we were lucky," he said softly, "maybe." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that some would return. After the war, dozens of former POWs came back to Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa. They married American women. They bought farms. They raised children who grew up pledging allegiance to the flag of the country that had once held their fathers behind wire. Their grandchildren, decades later, would post online messages of gratitude, saying, "America saved my grandfather's life." By late spring, Camp Hearn felt different. The fences were still there, the guard towers still manned, the rules unchanged. But something unspoken, something deeply human, had grown between the captors and the captives. The Americans no longer saw the Germans as Nazis. They saw them as young men who had been fed lies and sent into a war they had not chosen. And the Germans no longer saw the Americans as barbarians. They saw them as the kind of people who would offer a stranger a hot meal on Christmas, who would teach a prisoner their language, who would tip their hats from a truck passing along a country road. It was, in its own quiet way, a portrait of the America their grandchildren would one day feel nostalgic for. The America that believed decency was strength, that generosity was a duty, that unity was not merely a slogan, but a lived reality. An America that could look an enemy in the eye and still see a neighbor. And for the men inside Camp Hearn, that realization was the first true peace they had known in years. The war ended, as all wars eventually do, not with fanfare but with a quiet collapse of exhaustion. Germany surrendered in the spring of 1945. and over the next year the POW camps across America gradually emptied. One by one, the German prisoners boarded ships bound for a homeland none of them recognized anymore. A land scarred, divided, starved, and unsure of its own moral footing. And yet, something unexpected happened as the men left Camp Hearn. They cried. Some wept openly. Some tried to hide it, wiping their faces with the backs of their sleeves. Others embraced American guards who stiffened in surprise before returning the gesture with careful, paternal pats on the back. Many prisoners pressed folded notes into the guards' hands, thank you letters, sketches of scenes from the camp, carved wooden trinkets made during long evenings in the barracks. Richardson, the guard who had knelt beside Hoffman in the mess hall, stood at the edge of the departing column, his hat pulled low to hide the moisture in his eyes. Hoffman walked up to him just before boarding, reached out and gripped his hand with a strength that surprised them both. "Thank you," Hoffman whispered, "for everything." Richardson swallowed hard. "You take care of yourself, son." The men boarded the trucks, then the trains, then the ships. But the memory of Texas, the warmth, the food, the kindness, the strange feeling of being treated better by their jailers than by their own leaders, traveled home with them. In the decades that followed, a quiet pilgrimage began. Former POWs returned to America, not as enemies, not as soldiers, but as men seeking to reconnect with a chapter of their lives that had redefined them. Some came back in the 1950s, drawn by the shape of the land and the promise of a new beginning. They found jobs on ranches, in factories, in small-town stores. They married American women. They raised children who spoke English first and German second. Their families grew, stretching across states and generations, woven into the tapestry of American life. Others returned much later when age had carved lines across their faces and time had softened the sharp edges of their memories. They came with their children and grandchildren, retracing steps across a land they once saw through barbed wire. One story, retold in Texas towns for years, came from a family that arrived at Camp Hearn's memorial one summer morning in the late 1990s. The father, a gray-haired man in his 70s, stood quietly before the stone marker dedicated to the German POWs held there. His daughter placed a bouquet of white flowers at the base. "This is where he was kept?" the granddaughter asked gently. The man nodded. "Yes, here." The little girl studied his face, confused. "But Mama said it was a prison." The man exhaled, eyes soft. "It was," he said, "but it was the kindest prison a man could have hoped for." His daughter touched his arm. "What would have happened if he hadn't been captured?" He looked at the memorial stone, running his fingers across the carved letters. "If not for America," he said quietly, "my father would have died in Germany, in a camp run by our own people." Silence fell around them, thick with the weight of history. It was the kind of silence that reminds a person how thin the line is between survival and loss, cruelty and compassion, hatred and understanding. The family stayed for nearly an hour, walking the grounds slowly as if honoring ghosts. Before leaving, the granddaughter slipped a small folded paper beneath the bouquet. Later, a caretaker found it. It read simply, "Thank you for saving my family before I was even born." The legacy lived in writing, too. In the 1970s, a former POW named Carl Brenner published a memoir that would become quietly treasured by historians and families alike. He wrote about battles and fear and loss, but the chapter that readers remembered most was the one about Christmas 1944. In that chapter, Brenner described sitting before a plate of turkey in the Camp Hearn mess hall, hands trembling, eyes burning. He wrote of Hoffman's breakdown, of the Americans' quiet compassion, of the moment he realized everything he had been taught about the enemy was wrong. He ended the chapter with a passage that struck readers in the heart. "On that Christmas night, I learned the true measure of strength. America did not conquer us with weapons alone. They conquered us with something far greater, a humanity that could not be broken, not by war, not by hatred, not by fear. They were stronger because they chose to be good." It was the kind of truth that outlived the man who wrote it. And for Americans reading those words decades later, at kitchen tables and classrooms and libraries, they felt something stir deep inside them, something old, something both painful and beautiful, a pride that was not about victory, but about virtue, a nostalgia for a country that had once felt unified in purpose, confident in its values, and willing to carry the heavy moral burden of treating even its enemies with dignity. A quiet wish that the spirit of the greatest generation, their steadiness, their fairness, their refusal to meet hatred with hatred, might somehow find its way back into the America of today. Grandchildren of the guards who once walked the perimeter of Camp Hearn would say, "My granddad always said those prisoners were good boys." Children of former POWs would say, "My father always told me the American saved his life." And in online forums and quiet interviews, survivors' descendants left messages like, "My grandfather was a German POW in America. Thank you for how you treated him. He loved your country until the day he died. He cried every Christmas because of the kindness he found in Texas. Because the legacy was not buried in the past. It lived in families, in memories, in the moral compass of two nations once at war. In the end, the story of Camp Hearn was never just about prisoners or guards. It wasn't about turkey or apple pie or even Christmas. It was about a choice, a deliberate, unwavering choice, to believe that humanity was not a weakness in war, but its greatest strength. War can turn boys into monsters, but kindness offered even to an enemy can turn a monster back into a man. And the men who passed through Camp Hearn carried that truth with them for the rest of their lives. They carried it across oceans, into new families, into new countries. They passed it to their children, and their children passed it to theirs. The fences are gone now. The mess hall is gone. Only the wind moves across the Texas grass. But the legacy remains. A reminder that the greatest victories in history were not won with bullets. They were won with decency. Because war creates enemies, but only humanity has the power to turn those enemies into witnesses, and sometimes into friends.